When a stranger spotted a dog sat near a grave covered in blue roses, she instantly stopped her car. There was something about this sight that made her act, and when she learned of the pet's heartbreaking story, she understood just why. Alice Gill spends her life as a committed animal lover. In 2015, she worked with a southern pup rescue and retreat. One particular encounter with a helpless dog, though, made a big impression on her, and it led her to an unexpected quest to boot. On one day towards the end of 2015, Gill was on a country highway when she noticed something unexpected. A seemingly unaccompanied dog was sitting in a deserted graveyard. There was no one else around for miles. The graveyard was empty. The dog was completely alone. Distressingly, the white shepherd mix looked starving and thin. To survive, it had been searching for food around the graveyard. Gill knew the dog was in trouble, that if she didn't act, the dog might not make it out of the scene alive. Gill thankfully had food in her car to give to the poor pup, and she used this to encourage the animal to come closer. When the dog approached closer to Gill, in that moment, she suddenly realized that she was hiding a secret. Gill could see that the dog had recently given birth, as it was clear to her that she was producing milk and had a large and swollen belly. However, her babies were not by her side or anywhere to be seen. This worried Gill. Also noted the fact that the dog was clearly riddled with fleas. She had quite obviously been abandoned or had wandered far from her home. She couldn't leave the dog now. Gill had no idea how long the dog had been neglected for, but she could tell that it was definitely in need of some tender loving care. It became apparent, though, that the dog was definitely nervous of the human. Was this a sign of something? Gill grew fearful for the abandoned pet and knew that she couldn't leave it now, so the animal lover came up with a plan. While still aware that she couldn't take the dog without finding her babies, without their mom, they'd most likely die. But where could they be? Gill then raced home to pick up all the medication she could find in order to get rid of the parasites and ticks that were distressing the animal. Fortunately, when she returned, she found the dog was still in the graveyard and was willing to let her help it. It was now time that Gill put into action her endeavor to find out more. So she went to a neighboring house and knocked on the door. The homeowner, Carl, then answered, and Gill proceeded to ask him about the white dog. That's how Gill learned about the dog's heartbreaking story. According to Carl, her owner had died about a month beforehand, shortly before the beloved pet had given birth. And ever since then, the animal had visited a pile of blue roses on her human's grave. She spent her days at the grave, going back and forth caring for her puppies, Gill explained on Facebook in 2015. Dogs are well known to be particularly loyal animals, especially when they become so attached to their owners. Gill continues to explain the heartbreaking tale, saying, "No one knew where the babies were, but Carl directed me to the home of the deceased companion in search of her nephew who had apparently been feeding her when able. So Gill decided to search for the nephew of the dog's late owner. After traveling just a mile down the road, she located his home. Unfortunately, though, no one answered the door. What would she do now? Gill then went back to Carl to see if he would pass on her contact details. However, in a kind gesture, he instead said that he would drive around the neighborhood with her in search of the nephew. So once again, she pulled up outside the dog's former home, but this time with Carl. This time, instead of knocking, Carl told her to toot her horn. After she did so, the nephew slowly appeared. Upon questioning, he revealed that he had no idea where the dog's puppies were, though he did allow Gill to look over the property in her quest to find them. As Gill drove Carl home, she was saddened by the fact that the puppies were still missing. It was only on the route back that they spotted the dog headed somewhere. This, they realized, was their opportunity to follow the dog to see if it would bring them to the puppies. Alice explained, "She cut through the pasture to get away from the car, not realizing it was us. While driving Carl home, he called out, 'There she is now.' About 400 yards in front of us, she trotted toward us down the dirt road toward her home. She continued. We pulled out, back down the road, stopping periodically so as to not concern the mother." But before the two began to follow the dog, Gill turned to Carl and asked him to join her in prayer. And so, two strangers, far removed in every way, closed our eyes together and asked for God to lead us to help this family in honor of Mrs. Carey, who had passed. she would later reveal on Facebook. Not knowing she was being watched, Alice and Carl saw Mama walk toward an old shed, yet hesitate for some time. They assumed that she must have been waiting to check if the coast was clear. They were anxious for the dog to carry on so they could see if this was the answer they were looking for. It seemed that the pair were finally able to track the dog to her hiding place. They were nervous but excited. Suddenly, 3 tiny puppies emerged from the old shed. They were all hungry and cried out for their mom to be fed. What was interesting was that Gil had actually checked the shed for the puppies earlier but found nothing. She'd taught her babies well, she said on Facebook. But once Mom was home, 3 little girls came out of the woodworks, all cries of hunger and pleasure. And now that she'd located them all, Gil could finally bring the dogs to safety. So she took the mom and her puppies into her care. But would she be able to give them what they needed? She was worried that they needed to be looked after all the time, and as much as she wanted to, she didn't know what the best outcome for them would be. Alice and Carl did not expect any more surprises. They were so happy that they'd found the puppy and were planning their next move, when all of a sudden Mama came back around the corner. They hadn't even noticed that she'd gone. This time on her arrival, she came with a companion. It must have been the baby's dad. They couldn't believe their eyes. They never would have imagined that this could have happened. They were so happy that the puppies were safe and that their dad even came along. But how could they split them up now when they'd just been reunited? What would they do? This made for a difficult decision. Alice proceeded to rescue Mama Angel, her new name for her, Charlie, the dad, and their 3 little beautiful babies, whom she named Jacqueline, Kate, and Farah. This amazing little family was finally safe for the first time. It was so heartwarming to see them all together. What would she do now, though? She couldn't possibly keep all the babies and both dogs, as much as she wanted to. But how would she find them all new and safe places to live? This was a big responsibility that she was suddenly faced with. Carl was elated, but he couldn't take the puppies either. He set about to try and find a loving home for them, but it proved more difficult than he had thought. They didn't want to give them to a shelter, yet just before their luck seemed to run out, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The happy ever after to the story ends here, as Gil later managed to find the dogs loving homes with other dogs to play with. Hopefully, none of them will ever go hungry again. As for Gil, she continues to do as much as she can to help animals, and she keeps in contact with each of the families to check up on the puppies.